I want to thank you so much, Ellen. I want to thank the Foreign Policy Initiative and Freedom House for hosting today's important event. This event could not be more timely. It's an honor to share this forum with Senator Cardin as well, who I know has already spoken to you, who played such an important leadership role on the Magnitsky Legislation. I'm a proud co-sponsor of that legislation, and without Ben Cardin's tenacity, that piece of critical legislation would not have passed out of the Foreign Relations Committee yesterday. And I also want to recognize the former Prime Minister as well as Ms. Hollande. It is an honor to be here with you as well. With Secretary Clinton's visit this week, I would like to take a broader view of democracy in Russia and encourage different strategic thinking about United States and Russia relations. The Obama administration from the beginning approached Russia as if the strains in the relationship between the United States and Russia were the fault of the prior administration's approach to Russia, as if the Putin government's uncooperative actions on Iran and other issues resulted from justifiable Russian resentment against U.S. policy. As a result, President Obama has pursued an accommodating policy toward Mr. Putin, embarking on what he called a new approach to Russia in his reset policy. However, an honest examination of reset would have to lead you to the conclusion that this new approach has not resulted in a more beneficial relationship between Russia and the United States. There has not been a change for the better or enough change on Russia's policies toward Iran, North Korea, missile defense, democratization, or other matters of concern to the United States of America. And any fair-minded analyst has to conclude that reset has been a failure, and I hope that the administration takes a new approach. The state of relations between our two governments exists despite concessions which could be much better, despite concessions by the Obama administration as part of a broader strategy of the United States accommodation toward the Kremlin. In an effort to appease the Kremlin's concerns in his first year in office, President Obama abandoned U.S. plans to deploy U.S. NATO missile defenses in Europe, despite the fact that it was clear that the short and medium-range missile defenses pose no threat to Russia's much larger arsenal. In 2010, brushing aside the continued Russian occupation of Georgia, President Obama pushed through the controversial civil nuclear trade agreement with the Russians that had previously stalled because of Russia's assistance to Iran in their nuclear program and missile programs, as well as Russia's August 2008 invasion of Georgia. The Putin government has given the reset a brush-off through its actions in Syria, a rebuff of U.S. missile defense initiatives, continued occupation of the Georgian territory, and anti-democratic treatment of the Russian people. In Syria, despite Assad's brutal response to peaceful demonstrations with a systematic campaign of killing that has resulted in the deaths of 10,000 men, women, and children, President Putin has continued to support and provide weapons to the Assad regime. Russians' armed transfers and in opposition to the UN Security Council resolutions regarding Syria have enabled Assad to remain in power and, unfortunately, to continue to murder his own people. In the area of missile defense, the Kremlin's response has been equally disappointing. The United States and NATO have sought to develop a European missile defense shield to defend against potential ballistic missile threats from Iran. While this system could not defend against a Russian nuclear missile attack and therefore does not impact the Russian nuclear deterrent, Russian civilian and military leaders have responded with threats of preemptive attacks rather than a cooperative discussion so that our mutual interests could be advanced. The Obama administration's reset has also not elicited Russian concessions with respect to the country of Georgia. In 2008, Russia invaded Georgia with Russian troops, and they continue to occupy. And that's unfortunate. And finally, in terms of human rights, an issue that I know is of concern to every single person in this room, unfortunately, Russia's gone backwards in terms of human rights. Freedom House's 2012 Freedom in the World rankings categorizes Russia as not free. On a scale of 1 to 7, with 7 being the most oppressed, Freedom House gives Russia a 5 for civil liberties and a 6 for political rights. Mr. Putin and his allies have come to dominate the Russian media. Opposition groups are frequently denied the opportunity to register and have been targeted for raids. The death of Sergei Magnitsky and the case of Mikhail Khodorkovsky are two prominent examples of a broad and deeply troubling trend. There are many other examples that have not received as much international attention, but are yet still as compelling as the two examples that prompted the Magnitsky legislation. And to better understand the authoritarian character of the Putin government, one needs only to examine what Putin says and the company that Mr. Putin keeps. Mr. Putin makes a practice of speaking contemptuously about democracy, democratic activists, and journalists. He has also aligned the Russian government closely with the despotic regimes in Syria, in Iran, Nicaragua, North Korea, and Venezuela. You are a reflection of the company that you keep. It is time for the Obama administration to rethink its strategy toward Russia and to move to one that is less aligned with Mr. Putin and more aligned with achieving the mutual interests of the Russian and American people. And we have many, many mutual interests. America's interests are not in building up Mr. Putin's personal prestige through arms control signing ceremonies and through deference in the United Nations Security Council, where Mr. Putin can wield his veto and has not hesitated to do so in egregious cases like Syria. A wise United States policy toward Russia would align with those enlightened Russians who want what is truly best for their own country and for their people. Policies that would make Russia stronger economically, more secure, more humane, more respected, and more democratic. That is why it is important to support Russia's accession to the World Trade Organization, but also in conjunction to allowing Russia in the World Trade Organization to also pass the Sergei Magnitsky Rule of Law Accountability Act of 2012, so that a more prosperous, transparent Russia that is more integrated with the global economy, which is in Russia's interests, but will also respect the human rights of Russians. However, it is also in the interests of our two countries and our two peoples to stand with the Russian people and support their efforts to achieve the rights that we enjoy in the United States of America, including the right to have a government that represents their interests and does not target peaceful demonstrations and activists with violence and imprisonment. When Mr. Putin's government abuses peaceful Russian activists and protesters, we should hold them accountable by naming and shaming the culprits. That is the purpose and the power behind the Magnitsky legislation, and that is why I am so pleased that the Senate Foreign Relations Committee passed that legislation yesterday. But it is also why I'm concerned that an amendment was included to provide for a classified annex to that legislation. I don't know what's classified about violating human rights. I can't understand that. And I respect the attempts that were made by members of the committee to scrutinize the decisions in terms of who would go on the classified annex and to make it more difficult for the administration to add names to the classified annex. That's certainly a step in the right direction. But if the purpose of the legislation is to hold the Putin government accountable for the shameful abuses of the Russian people as highlighted by what happened to Sergei Magnitsky in that prison where he was tortured and killed, then hiding the names of the culprits on a classified annex directly undercuts the power of the Magnitsky legislation. And so I will certainly support this legislation, and I hope that it comes forward very quickly to a full vote before the United States Senate, conditioned on the WTO admission. The two should go together. But this classified annex issue, I'm really at a loss to understand what is classified with those who violate human rights, like the individuals who were responsible for murdering Sergei Magnitsky. Unfortunately, I'm disappointed that the Obama administration has opposed the Magnitsky legislation from the beginning, instead of championing this legislation. And I hope that they change their position on this and that the president comes forward and champions this important legislation. I fear that the administration will attempt to use this classified annex to undercut the intent and effectiveness of the Magnitsky legislation. And again, I plan to support this on the floor, but please know, if it's passed with this classified annex, there will be those of us in Congress watching very, very carefully what happens with that annex to make sure that it is not used to hide individuals within the Putin administration or the Russian government who are torturing and murdering people. The United States has immediate interests that are aligned with Russia, and there are so many ways that we can cooperate together. For example, a large portion of the equipment for our troops in Afghanistan travels along the Northern Distribution Network, which connects Afghanistan with the Baltic, Caspian ports via Russia, Central Asia, and the Caucasus, and this is very, very important to our battle in Afghanistan. Since the closure of the ground supply routes through Pakistan in 2011, the United States has relied even more heavily on the Northern Distribution route. And we wouldn't want to see the simultaneous closure of the Northern Distribution Network and the supply routes through Pakistan. So this is an important area of United States-Russian cooperation. Also, we would like to see more cooperation from Russia in preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon and in opposing the development of North Korea's nuclear weapon capabilities. Russia has interests as large as those of the United States in opposing the proliferation of nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. But the Putin government often acts as if we don't share those interests. It acts as if it is more important to counter the United States' influence in that area of the world rather than to advance our common interests in non-proliferation. This seems to gratify Mr. Putin, but it certainly doesn't help us or the Russian people. In light of this dilemma, it is important to return to the basics and review 5 axioms I believe should guide the United States policy toward Russia. First, the Cold War is over, thankfully, and we have no interest in reviving it. Second, Russia is not the Soviet Union. The latter was an ideological enemy of the United States of America, which we aim to defeat. Russia is a country that we would be happy to see prosper and become a strong, respected member of the international community like Germany, Japan, and other former enemies of the United States of America. Third, the United States and Russia share major national security interests. Fourth, Putin's interests are not necessarily those of the Russian people. In fact, they're often directly at odds. Fifth, and finally, we do not reduce the likelihood of conflict with Russia by accommodation to Mr. Putin and by reducing our military capabilities in the field of missile defense or elsewhere. Russia has a serious national security interest in managing the rise of China, as do we, addressing Islamist extremism, as do we, preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, as do we, and creating an economic and business environment that encourages investment in Russia from U.S. companies and mutual economic relations that will benefit both of our economies. Yet, in all of the examples that I just cited of our mutual interest, Mr. Putin is pursuing policies that directly undercut the Russian interests I just identified. The Russians have a strong interest in creating an economic and business environment integrated with the global economy that encourages investment in Russia and helps to grow the Russian economy. Yet Mr. Putin has not tolerated, if not encouraged corruption within the Russian government and lack of the rule of law that directly undercuts these economic interests of the Russian people. You can look at the Corruption Perception Index from Russia. You can look at the World Bank's Doing Business survey. It's all incredibly negative. But let's get down to some basics. If you're in a situation where the businessman gets raped and his lawyer gets murdered, capital's not going to come to Russia if those are the conditions upon which business leaders are treated in that country, as exemplified by the Sergei Magnitsky situation. And so the more we have rule of law in Russia, the less corruption there is, and the more respect for human rights, the more the Russian economy will thrive and grow, and we can work together for our mutual interests. In the past decade, under Mr. Putin's leadership, Russia's dependence on oil has increased dramatically. Mr. Putin would rather concentrate on drilling for oil and gas, which has certainly been a very positive impact on the Russian economy, but he has not also focused his attention on the skills and education of the Russian people and the abilities of the Russian people. Instead, he chooses to make sure that the oil and gas revenue directly benefits a small clique of loyalists within the regime, rather than more broadly support in a fair way all of the Russian people. This myopic approach to energy exports in lieu of genuine economic and democratic reform that would fully unlock the potential of the Russian people has worked well for Mr. Putin personally. However, it has not put the Russian economy on a sustainable path, given the fact that Russia's oil output is projected to reach a plateau from the middle of this decade onward, and that he has benefited from the high oil prices. Allow me to cite one more example to highlight what I believe is the difference between Mr. Putin's interests and the Russian people. Russia has a strong national security interest, which I've mentioned, in preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. If Iran acquires a nuclear weapon, the Iranian regime will become more aggressive toward its neighbors. In time, Russia is at least as likely as the United States to come into a confrontation with a nuclear-armed Iran. Russia and Iran are close to one another geographically. Both have significant and often conflicting interests in the neighborhood. And Russia has tense relations with its predominantly Muslim neighboring states in the south. It is not at all far-fetched to imagine Russia and an emboldened, nuclear-armed Iran coming into conflict with one another, perhaps even in a place like Azerbaijan. Despite Russia's strong national security interest in preventing Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon, Mr. Putin has served as the single most important enabler of the Iranian nuclear program. While Mr. Putin visited Israel this week, his policy has been to undercut attempts to address Iran's as well as North Korea's nuclear misbehavior at the UN Security Council. Mr. Putin short-sightedly views the Iranian nuclear program as a way to oppose the United States, yet he is helping to create a beast in his own backyard that one day will be as likely to bite Russia as it will be to bite the United States of America. While turmoil in the Middle East keeps oil prices high and benefits Putin, with his narrow focus on Russia's oil and natural gas exports, the strategic interests of the Russian people are not fully served and are not served at all by an Iranian nuclear weapons capability and all the harm that that may spawn. The type of error Mr. Putin is making regarding Iran has historical precedent. In the wake of World War I, there were two international pariahs in Europe, the defeated Germans and the Bolsheviks in Russia. The Versailles Treaty placed arms control restrictions on the Germans. Yet the Bolsheviks, in a move they no doubt believed to be a clever way to stick their thumb in the eye of Western powers, helped the Germans evade the arms control restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. The Russians helped the Germans with training and testing of war materials, specifically airplanes, poison gas, and tanks. This Russian cooperation was part of the Rapallo diplomacy, a reference to the 1922 treaty between the Soviet Union and Weimar Germany. Not many years later, Russia, more than any other country, suffered at the hands of the Nazis, whose war machine the Russians helped create. It is estimated that between 20 and 30 million Russians died in World War II. The Russians once again played a dangerous game by protecting and cooperating, are doing the same, I worry, by cooperating with Iran. And I would hope that they would see the error of their ways. In conclusion, Russia, while still a significant power with a major nuclear weapons arsenal, no longer represents the ideological or military threat to the United States that the Soviet Union did. Russia's conventional military forces, while still substantial, are far inferior to the Soviet military. Similarly, Russia confronts a major demographic crisis that presents a significant threat to Russia's long-term military and economic power. All of this can be improved and changed if Mr. Putin will do what is right for the Russian people. Yet in the phrase we use to discuss Russia, in the negotiations we engage in and the treaties that we enact in this country, we act as if Russia sometimes is still the Soviet Union. When we do this, we give Mr. Putin a gift and play right into his hands. When we appropriately condemn Putin's policies in Syria and Georgia, and when we call attention to the poor state of human rights and transparency in Russia, we must speak forcefully and put the blame where it belongs, at the feet of Mr. Putin. That is exactly what the president did not do with Mr. Putin at the G20 summit this month in Mexico. In fact, the dialogue with Putin at the G20 summit represents a perfect example of why I hope that the Obama administration will rethink its reset policy and why it is not the right approach toward Russia. The Obama-Putin dialogue in Mexico was a critical opportunity for the United States to lead and advance our national interests and to help the Syrian people. Mr. Obama should have called on Mr. Putin to end Russian arm shipments to Syria and to join the international community in calling for Mr. Assad to leave power. Sadly, the president did not push Mr. Putin on this issue. Instead, President Obama and Mr. Putin issued a joint statement that failed to even mention Mr. Assad, ignored Russia's continued military support for the illegitimate regime, and the statement that they did issue had no indication that we were calling on Russia to stop their arms shipment. It was very disappointing. And it portrayed the Assad military and the opposition as morally equivalent. And I don't believe that the Assad regime and the opposition are morally equivalent in any way. This lack of moral clarity in the United States leadership at a critical moment can only be viewed as a tragic and major missed opportunity. And unfortunately, I think another indication that we need to rethink our policy toward Russia. America is not and should not be anti-Russian. The Russian people deserve our support, our respect, and our cooperation. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and other senior Russian officials have described the Magnitsky Legislation as anti-Russian. The truth is just the opposite. We serve the Russian people and United States national security interests when we speak up for human rights in Russia and condemn Mr. Putin's foreign policies that make Russians and Americans less safe, and we must make clear that America welcomes a strong and prosperous Russia that plays by the international rules, that promotes peace and stability, and respects the human rights of the Russian people and those around the world. I thank you so much for having me today at this very important conference.
So Senator Ayotte, thank you very much. That was a terrific bipartisan bookend to the beginning of our conference with Senator Cardin. Please also again join me in thanking Mikhail Kasyanov and Christina Oyland, and thanks to Foreign Policy Initiative and my team at Freedom House. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming. Meeting adjourned.